The salvage yard sprawled across the crimson desert like the bones of a massive beast. Rusted hull plating, twisted girders, and the skeletal remains of at least a dozen spacecraft littered the landscape, creating a metallic graveyard that Sienna Valdez had spent the last 3 years painstakingly cataloging and dismantling. The twin sons of Kesara Prime beat down mercilessly, turning the exposed metal into instruments of torment. Yet she preferred this desolate solitude to the crowded, suffocating mining colony 20 kilometers away. She was welding a circuit board salvaged from an old Federation transport when her scanner picked up the distress signal. At first, she ignored it. Distress signals were as common as dust storms on this world, usually triggered by solar flares or equipment malfunctions. But something about the pattern nagged at her, a familiar Valorian modulation that made her pause mid-dash weld. The solar flare had been unprecedented, one of the worst in a decade. The news feeds had been broadcasting warnings all morning. Before the colony's communication systems went dark, Sienna hadn't paid much attention at the time, too absorbed in her work. But now her gut twisted with something uncomfortable that might have been concern. She turned off her equipment and climbed onto the reinforced platform that served as her workshop's roof. The sky was an angry shade of orange, roiled with electromagnetic disturbances that made her teeth ache. Across the desert to the west, something was burning. Not the gentle glow of a controlled industrial fire, but the violent, chaotic flames of a catastrophe. The Valorian refugee camp. Sienna climbed down and grabbed her emergency kit, telling herself it was professional instinct. Salvage operators who ignored distress signals sometimes lost their licenses, or worse, their lives when someone else received a reward for rescue that should have been theirs. That's what she told herself as she fired up her truck, a reinforced ground vehicle designed for traversing the treacherous terrain of the outer desert. The drive took 30 minutes. By the time she arrived, the fires had burned themselves out, leaving behind a wasteland of scorched tents and blackened equipment. The camp had been small, maybe 100 refugees, mostly families who had fled the Valorian Collective's social restructuring programs. They had been here less than a month, living in temporary shelters while processing applications for permanent settlement in the colony. Now, there was very little left. Sienna moved through the ruins slowly, checking each shelter, half expecting to find nothing but ash and sorrow. She was so focused on the devastation that she almost missed the soft sound of distressed breathing coming from beneath a collapsed support beam. The woman was trapped under a section of polycarbonate paneling, her luminescent blue-green skin contrasting sharply with the char marks across her body. She had the delicate features typical of her species, with high cheekbones and large eyes that held an almost feline quality. But it was fear and determination burning in those eyes as she struggled to free herself. "Don't move," Sienna called out, rushing forward. "I'll get you out." The woman's eyes widened, and she went absolutely still, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Please," she whispered, her accent soft and musical. "My siblings. I had 2 siblings with me. They were sleeping near the rear entrance." Sienna lifted the paneling carefully, her muscles screaming with effort, and helped the woman to her feet. The Valorian was smaller than her, delicate-boned in a way that made Sienna feel suddenly protective. But there was a steel in her posture that suggested fragility was merely appearance. "Come on," Sienna said, keeping a hand on the woman's elbow. "Let's find them." The rear of the camp was a hellscape of twisted metal and ash. Sienna was beginning to think they'd search in vain when a small sound cut through the silence. A child's whimper, barely audible. They found them buried under a section of tent fabric and insulation material. 2 younger Valorians, a boy who looked to be around 16 and a girl no more than 12, huddled together in a pocket of relative safety beneath a ridge of corrugated metal. The boy's arm was around his sister protectively, and both their eyes widened in fear as Sienna and the woman approached. "Kaitara." The boy breathed, relief flooding his features. I know," the woman Kaitara said, kneeling beside them. "I know, but we're going to be okay. This human is going to help us." Sienna didn't correct her. She simply pulled them free from the rubble and checked them both for injuries. The girl had a nasty gash on her shoulder, and the boy's leg was probably sprained, but neither injury seemed life-threatening. She wrapped them as best she could using supplies from her kit and helped them to her truck. "We need to get to the colony medical center," the boy said, his voice carrying an odd combination of fear and authority. "They'll know what to do. Our identification documents might still be in the admin building. The admin building is gone," Sienna said gently, gesturing to the raised structure across the camp. The flare hit everything simultaneously. "By now, the colony's systems will be overwhelmed. We'll go to my place first. I have medical supplies, and we can assess what needs to happen next when communications are restored." Kaitara exchanged a look with her brother, some silent conversation passing between them. Then she turned to Sienna, and in that moment, Sienna saw something unexpected in those luminescent eyes. Trust, not because Sienna had proven herself trustworthy, but because they had no other choice. And Kaitara was the type to accept necessity without complaint. "What's your name?" Kaitara asked as they climbed into the cab of the truck. "Sienna Valdez. I'm Kaitara," the woman replied. "This is my brother Jean and my sister Mira. We're deeply in your debt. You're alive," Sienna said, pulling the truck into a careful turn back toward the salvage yard. "That's enough," but as she drove across the desert, the twin suns casting long shadows behind them, Sienna was aware of Kaitara watching her with an intensity that suggested this Valorian woman was trying to solve a puzzle. Sienna had spent 3 years avoiding complications, avoiding connections, and avoiding anything that might require her to care about another person's fate. Now, with this alien woman and her injured siblings in her truck, Sienna had the uncomfortable sensation that all of those careful walls she'd built were about to come crashing down. The salvage yard materialized out of the desert haze like a metal mirage, and Sienna guided the truck through the entrance, suddenly very aware of how isolated this place was. "How alone. Welcome to my home," Sienna said, pulling the truck to a stop outside her workshop. "It's not much, but it's safe." Kaitara placed a delicate hand on Sienna's shoulder, and even through the fabric of her jacket, Sienna could feel the warmth of her skin. "You are much more than you seem to think you are," Kaitara said quietly. "Thank you for that." Sienna didn't know how to respond, so she simply helped them out of the truck and led them inside, into the unknown territory that lay ahead. 3 weeks had passed since Sienna pulled the siblings from the ruins of the refugee camp, and her salvage yard had transformed into something unrecognizable. The workshop that had once been her quiet sanctuary now echoed with voices, footsteps, and the peculiar sounds of Valorian speech, a language that seemed to blend song with conversation in ways that made Sienna's chest ache whenever Kaitara spoke. Mira had claimed the corner of the main workshop as her recovery space, surrounded by makeshift cushions and blankets that Sienna had salvaged from old transport vessels. The girl's shoulder wound had healed remarkably well, with Valorian biology proving far more resilient than Sienna had expected. Jean had taken to helping with repairs, his injured leg now strong enough for careful movement around the salvage yard. He had a methodical mind and an earnest desire to be useful, which reminded Sienna of herself before cynicism had calcified into habit. But it was Kaitara who occupied most of Sienna's thoughts, in ways that made her productivity plummet and her focus scatter like solar dust. This morning, she found Kaitara on the workshop roof, watching the twin suns rise. The Valorian woman wore clothes Sienna had salvaged for her human styles, that she'd adjusted to accommodate the subtle differences in Valorian physiology. The pale gray fabric contrasted beautifully with Kaitara's luminescent skin, which seemed to absorb and reflect the early light. "You're up early," Sienna said, handing her a cup of synthesized coffee. It wasn't what Kaitara would have consumed on her home world, but the woman had taken to it with surprising enthusiasm. "Your world doesn't sleep the same way mine did," Kaitara replied, accepting the cup. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Sienna felt that familiar flutter in her chest that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. On Valora, we had 3 distinct rest cycles aligned with our planetary rotation. Here, everything is accelerated. It takes time to adjust. Sienna settled beside her, maintaining what she hoped was a professional distance. "How are you adjusting otherwise?" Kaitara was quiet for a moment, her luminescent eyes reflecting the rust and gold tones of the salvage yard below. "Your world is harsher than mine," she finally said. "More utilitarian, less concern for aesthetics, more focus on function. At first, I found it deeply unsettling. Now, I'm beginning to appreciate the honesty in it. No pretense, no elaborate social hierarchies demanding constant performance." "Sounds like you didn't love your old life much," Sienna observed. "My old life was comfortable," Kaitara said carefully. "But comfort and fulfillment are not the same thing. I was educated, well-positioned in society, but I felt constrained, like I was playing a role rather than living." She turned to look at Sienna directly. "Are you not constrained, living out here alone?" Sienna took a long drink of her coffee to avoid answering. The truth was complicated. She'd fled to the desert after a corporate contract job had gone catastrophically wrong, killing people she was supposed to protect. She'd told herself she preferred solitude, that connections were liabilities, that caring about people was a weakness she couldn't afford. Then 3 Valorians had crashed into her life, and suddenly her carefully constructed isolation felt less like sanctuary and more like a prison. "Sometimes," Sienna admitted, "but it's my choice, and now," Kaitara asked softly, "do you still wish us gone?" The question hung between them, weighted with implication. Sienna could lie, could tell Kaitara that having refugees underfoot was an inconvenience, a temporary arrangement until they could access the colony's resources and move on. But Kaitara had a way of seeing through Sienna's defenses, as if the Valorian woman possessed some innate ability to read the emotional frequencies beneath words. "No," Sienna said. "I don't wish you gone." Kaitara smiled, and it transformed her entire face, softening the angular elegance of her features into something almost dangerously beautiful. "Good, because Jin and I have been discussing our options, and Mira refuses to leave. Your salvage yard has become her favorite place in the world. She's convinced that the components you recover could be repurposed into something entirely new." "She's not wrong," Sienna said. "Most salvage operations treat materials as commodities, but with the right knowledge, recycled tech can be more efficient than new manufacturing." "Then perhaps we could help," Kaitara suggested. "We could contribute. We could work over the next few days." Sienna found herself establishing routines with the 3 Valorians. She taught Mira about circuit design and component functionality, delighting in the girl's sharp questions and intuitive grasp of mechanical principles. Jin proved invaluable in the heavier work, his strength and precision making quick work of tasks that usually took Sienna hours. But it was her time alone with Kaitara that Sienna found herself anticipating with almost painful intensity. The Valorian woman was a quick study, absorbing knowledge about Sienna's salvage operation with focused determination. But more than that, Kaitara asked questions that went deeper, probing Sienna's philosophy, her approach to life, her reasons for the choices she made. It felt like Kaitara was attempting to understand not just what Sienna did, but who Sienna was beneath the protective layers of sarcasm and distance you speak about. "People as if they're inherently disappointing," Kaitara observed one afternoon as they sorted through a shipment of engine components. "Yet you saved 3 strangers without hesitation." "That was different," Sienna argued, though even she wasn't entirely convinced by her own words. "That was survival instinct, practical necessity." "No," Kaitara said, setting down the component she'd been examining and fixing Sienna with that penetrating gaze. "That was compassion. You can disguise it however you like, but I can see it. I can see you, Sienna. And what I see is someone far more capable of kindness than you allow yourself to acknowledge." The intensity of her gaze made Sienna's breath catch. For a moment, she thought Kaitara might close the distance between them, might do something that would shatter the fragile equilibrium they'd established. But then the Valorian woman turned back to the components, leaving Sienna suspended in a state of wanting and uncertainty. Everything changed the day the merchant arrived. Darius Vex was a human trader who made irregular runs through the outer settlements, buying salvage from operators like Sienna and selling it to higher-level distributors. He was handsome in an expensive, polished way that stood in stark contrast to Sienna's dessert-roughened appearance, and he'd always treated her with the casual arrogance of someone who believed his credentials and connections made him superior. but when he saw Kaitara, his entire demeanor shifted. Remarkable, he breathed, circling Kaitara slowly as if she were a particularly valuable piece of salvage. I've never seen a Valorian up close before. How much would you take for her? He asked, turning to Sienna with a predatory smile. I have contacts on Zenith Station. They pay premium prices for exotic talents, language skills, cultural knowledge, all that sophisticated education Valorians are famous for. Sienna felt something cold and dangerous crystallize in her chest. She's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Dryas said with a laugh. What about the others? You've got two more of them, right? I could take all three off your hands, set you up nicely. Sienna moved before she fully registered the action, placing herself between Dryas and Kaitara. Get off my property, easy, Valdez, Dryas said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Just offering a business opportunity. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. After he left, the salvage yard felt charged with tension. Jin and Mira emerged from the workshop, their expressions dark with understanding of what Dryas had been proposing. But it was Kaitara who approached Sienna, reaching out to gently touch her forearm. Thank you, Kaitara said quietly. For protecting us, it's what I do, Sienna replied, though they both knew it was becoming something far more significant than that. That night, as Sienna lay in her bed unable to sleep, she faced the truth she'd been avoiding. She wasn't protecting Kaitara because it was the right thing to do, or because of some abstract principle of justice. She was protecting Kaitara because the thought of losing her of anything happening to this remarkable Valorian woman who had somehow burrowed past every defensive wall Sienna had constructed felt like it would hollow out everything essential from Sienna's existence. She was falling in love with an alien woman who had crashed into her life exactly when she'd convinced herself she was incapable of such vulnerability, and terrifyingly, she thought Kaitara might be falling too. The trouble started small, the way most catastrophes do. A black market trader asking too many questions about Valorian whereabouts. A colony official stopping by the salvage yard with an unusual amount of interest. Then the encrypted message that came through the old communications. Ray Sienna kept hidden in the workshop. Basement. It was from an underground resistance network that had been helping refugee species escape exploitation. The message was short and brutal. Your Valorians are on a priority acquisition list for the Genetic Research Division of Hegemonic Industries. If they find them, they will be taken. Sienna read the message 3 times before letting it fully sink in. Hegemonic Industries didn't engage in rescue operations or peaceful relocation. They conducted abductions. They disappeared people into research facilities where ethics were secondary concerns. To profit margins. She'd worked for them once, before she'd discovered exactly what her salvage operations were being used for. Before she'd realized she was helping them acquire specimens. The thought of Kaitara in their hands made her stomach revolt. She was still sitting in the darkness of the basement, processing this information, when Kaitara found her. The Valorian woman descended the stairs with practiced quietness, carrying 2 cups of the herbal tea she'd learned to prepare from concentrates. Sienna had salvaged months ago. Jin said you looked troubled, Kaitara said, settling beside Sienna on the makeshift bench. In our culture, we don't hide from worry. We share it. Sienna wanted to shield her from this, to protect Kaitara from knowing that danger had been circling closer each day. But Kaitara deserved to know what they were facing. We have to leave, Sienna said quietly, showing her the message. Tonight, Kaitara read it twice, her luminescent eyes reflecting the screen's cold light. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. The colony, no. The outer settlements are too exposed. Hegemonic has resources there. Sienna's mind was already working through contingencies. Escape routes, resources they could carry. There's a region called the Stillwater Wastes, about 400 kilometers northeast. It's considered uninhabitable by most settlers. Too many electromagnetic anomalies from a crashed ship's reactor core decades ago. But if we can get past the anomalies, there's a canyon system where people disappear intentionally. Communities that don't want to be found. You knew about this place before? Kaitara asked. I've always kept exit strategies prepared, Sienna admitted. It's the salvage operator's creed. Know how to disappear if things go wrong. Kaitara set down the message and took Sienna's hand. Then we disappear. But we do it together. Getting Jin and Mira ready took 40 minutes. The siblings packed quickly. Having learned during their initial displacement that possessions became anchors, Sienna gathered supplies, medical kits, water purification tablets, protein rations, the emergency funds she'd stashed in various locations around the salvage yard. She also gathered something else, the plasma rifles and defensive equipment she'd collected over the years but never used. If Hegemonic came looking, Sienna intended to make sure they paid a price. They were loading the truck when they heard the approach of heavy vehicles across the desert. Too many engines, moving with military precision. Hegemonic security forces, faster than Sienna had anticipated. Go, Sienna said, pushing Kaitara toward the truck. I'll buy you time. Absolutely not, Kaitara said, her voice hard in a way Sienna had never heard before. If you think I'm leaving you here, there's no time to argue, Sienna snapped. Get Jin and Mira into the truck. Head toward those rock formations northeast. When you see the first of the electromagnetic towers, follow the base of the canyon. There's a marker carved into the stone to intersecting lines. That's the entrance. Sienna, I love you, Sienna said, the words spilling out in the chaos, because sometimes you don't get second chances. Sometimes you have to say the important things before time runs out. I know this is terrible timing, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed to tell you that. I love you. Now please get out of here. Kaitara's eyes widened, luminescent depths swirling with emotion. For a moment, Sienna thought she would refuse to go, would stay and fight. Instead, Kaitara closed the distance between them and kissed her, fierce and desperate and full of everything. Jian said between them. When she pulled back, her own eyes were wet. I love you too, Kaitara whispered. I have for weeks. Come back to me, Sienna. Promise me you'll come back. I promise, Sienna said. And she meant it with every part of her being. Jin and Mira were in the truck. Sienna pushed Kaitara toward the passenger seat and slammed the door. Then she sprinted toward the workshop, grabbing a rifle and positioning herself behind the heavy equipment salvage pile. That provided a natural fortification. The security forces arrived in 3 vehicles, sleek military transports equipped with advanced sensors and weaponry far superior to anything Sienna could improvise. But they weren't expecting resistance. They were expecting 3 refugees and a salvage operator who would surrender without a fight. Sienna's first shot took out the lead transport's sensor ray. The second disabled the communication system of the second vehicle. She wasn't trying to win a firefight that would be suicidal. She was trying to create confusion, delay, give Kaitara time to put distance between them. We have the salvage yard surrounded, a voice boomed across an amplified speaker. Surrender peacefully and you will not be harmed. Sienna fired again, this time aiming for the fuel cells of the closest vehicle. The explosion that followed lit the desert night in brilliant orange, providing the truck with perfect camouflage as Kaitara accelerated away across the sand, heading northeast toward the rock formations. For a moment, Sienna allowed herself to believe they would make it, that this woman she loved, this remarkable Valorian who had taught her how to feel again, would be safe, that they'd find each other in the wastelands and build something real far from hegemonic industries. An exploitation. Then the security forces returned fire in earnest, and Sienna had to focus on survival. She managed to destroy the remaining vehicle's ability to pursue, but not without cost. A plasma bolt caught her left shoulder, burning through flesh and bone in ways that made everything white and screaming. She dragged herself into the workshop, knowing she had maybe 20 minutes before Hegemonic sent backup, before they cordoned off the entire region. Using the workshop's emergency systems, she sealed all the doors and activated the building's self-destruct sequence carefully, programmed to destroy the most valuable salvage without triggering a catastrophic explosion that would be visible for kilometers. Let Hegemonic think she'd died in the blast. Let them think the salvage yard had been a dead end. She limped toward the salvage yard's perimeter, where an old solar-powered scout vehicle had been gathering dust in a storage shed for years. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't equipped for survival in the wastes, but it was mobile. As Sienna drove into the dark desert, trailing blood and leaving a false trail away from the direction Kaitara had gone, She held on to one thought with desperate intensity. I promised I would come back to her. And Sienna Valdez had learned long ago that if you made a promise to someone you loved, you found a way to keep it, no matter what it cost. The canyon was more beautiful than Sienna had expected. Even through the haze of pain and blood loss, towering sandstone walls rose in impossible formations, sculpted by millennia of wind and rare desert rains into shapes that suggested ancient architecture. The electromagnetic anomalies that had kept the region isolated manifested as subtle distortions in the air, visible only as shimmer and haze where reality seemed slightly out of focus. It took Sienna for days to reach the canyon entrance. The wound on her shoulder had become infected despite her best efforts at field treatment, and fever had begun to blur her perceptions. She was operating on instinct and determination. When she finally saw the marker, two intersecting lines carved into the stone face, weathered but unmistakable, she almost didn't see the figure standing in the shadows until it resolved into Kaitara, who was suddenly there, running toward her across the rocky terrain with a desperation that made Sienna's chest constrict. Despite the fever fog, "No, no, no," Kaitara was saying, her hands fluttering over Sienna's shoulder wound with gentle urgency. "You're hurt. You're burning up. Why didn't you find shelter? Why are you alone?" Sienna wanted to explain that she'd needed to make sure Hegemonic couldn't track her directly to Kaitara's location, that she deliberately led them on a false trail. But all that emerged was a croaking laugh. "You came," Sienna managed. "You waited." "Of course I waited," Kaitara said fiercely, tears streaming down her luminescent cheeks. "I would wait forever if that's what it took. Now stop talking and let me help you." The resistance community in the canyon was larger than Sienna had anticipated. Perhaps 200 people, a mix of human refugees, Valorians, and several other alien species, all living in a network of shelters carved into the canyon walls. They'd established infrastructure over years of careful development, water purification systems, hydroponic gardens, solar panels hidden in recessed chambers to avoid detection. The community's leader was a woman named Elena, a former colonial administrator who'd fled after refusing orders to cooperate with Hegemonic's acquisition programs. She took one look at Sienna's wound and assigned her to the medical station, where a quiet man named Thomas, a veterinarian by training, a doctor by necessity, spent 3 days ensuring Sienna didn't die of infection. Kaitara barely left her side. "You need rest," Thomas insisted when he found Kaitara still sitting vigil beside Sienna's cot on the 4th morning. "She will wake up disoriented and frightened," Kaitara replied calmly. "I need to be here when it happens." Sienna did wake disoriented, but the first thing she saw was Kaitara's face, and suddenly the world reorganized itself into something bearable. The Valorian woman was there with water, then later with soup, then simply with her hand in Sienna's, holding on as if physical contact could anchor Sienna to this place, to this life, to her. "How long was I out?" Sienna asked once she could form complete sentences. 5 days total, Kaitara said. "Jean and Mira are worried sick," but Elena made them understand that too many people in the medical chamber would only stress you. "They're helping with the gardens. Mira has adapted remarkably well. She's redesigning the irrigation system using principles you taught her about resource efficiency." Sienna smiled weakly. "And you?" "I've been making sure you stayed alive," Kaitara said simply. Everything else was secondary. Recovery was slow, but by the second week, Sienna was well enough to move around the canyon. Elena found her sitting outside the medical station, watching the sunset paint the sandstone walls in shades of purple and gold. "Thomas says you're healing faster than expected," Elena said, settling beside her. "Apparently having a determined Valorian woman refusing to let you die is medically beneficial." Sienna felt heat creep up her neck. It's complicated. It's love," Elena said plainly. "I've seen enough of it in this canyon to recognize it in any form. And you're clearly the same way about her. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk with you." Elena explained that the canyon community had been planning to expand, to create a larger sanctuary for refugees fleeing exploitation across multiple systems. But they'd been limited by lack of resources and expertise. They needed someone who understood salvage operations, who could identify valuable materials, Who could help them construct equipment from salvaged components? I need you, Elena said. Your skills, your knowledge, your experience with the kind of people who trade in human lives. We're trying to build something different here. A place where species can live together without hierarchies or exploitation. But we can't do it without people who understand both the worlds we're trying to escape and the world we're trying to create. Sienna considered the offer. The old her, the cynical salvage operator who'd built walls of isolation around her heart, would have refused, would have taken her injury as an excuse to disappear, to find some empty corner of the galaxy where she could be alone again. But that version of Sienna had died in the burning salvage yard, shot through with plasma fire and desperation. Yes, Sienna said. I'll help. The next 3 months were a blur of purposeful activity. Sienna worked with teams of both human and Valorian engineers, identifying salvageable components from the crashed ship's reactor chamber that had originally caused the electromagnetic disturbances. They repurposed the materials into medical equipment, communication systems, and defense networks. Slowly, the canyon community began to evolve from a hidden refuge into something approaching genuine infrastructure. And through it all, Kaitara was there, not hovering, not overbearing, but present. She'd taken to assisting in the medical station, discovering she had a natural aptitude for care. Her diplomatic training proved invaluable in mediating cultural conflicts between the various refugee species. She was building her own life in the canyon, carving out her own purpose. But she was doing it alongside Sienna rather than separate from her. One evening, as they worked together in the hydroponic gardens, Kaitara tending to Valorian plant species, Sienna checking the irrigation systems she'd helped design, Kaitara stopped and turned to face Sienna directly. I want to tell you something, Kaitara said, her luminescent eyes reflecting the sunset that streamed through the canyon opening. When I first met you, I saw a woman so afraid of being hurt that she'd built a fortress out of isolation. I wanted to help you break those walls down. But now I realize that wasn't the gift. What was? Sienna asked. You chose to break them down yourself, Kaitara said softly. You chose to let me in. You chose to fight for us. You chose to promise me you'd come back. And then you kept that promise despite being shot and hunted and in pain. That's the real gift, not that I saved you, but that you saved yourself because you had something worth saving for. Sienna crossed the distance between them and kissed Kaitara gently, tenderly, with all the love and gratitude she couldn't quite find words for. When she pulled back, she was smiling. Stay with me? Sienna asked. Not just here in the canyon, but really stay. Build this life with me. Number running, no hiding, just building. Always, Kaitara promised. They didn't notice Elena watching from across the garden, a knowing smile on her face. The community's leader was already thinking about the next phase of their expansion, the next group of refugees who would need sanctuary. And she was thinking about how, sometimes, the most powerful resistance movements were built not on weapons or strategy alone, but on love, on people choosing each other, again and again, choosing each other.